Come on. Go.
Come on.
More. More.
What up? So, not at the garage today. I'm here at the gym due to very non-important reasons. But wanted to still keep this train going and just discussing training topics every training session or most training sessions. And today I wanted to talk about hypertrophy, muscle hypertrophy, obviously. Whether that is if you're an Olympic weightlifter trying to gain mass, if you're a power lifter trying to gain muscle mass, or you're just anybody out there trying to put on some muscle. So I just want to start out by saying your muscle, the amount of muscle mass you can produce is going to be limited. That's mainly going to be limited by your genetics and therefore your physiology. So if we kind of look at the people that we know to be super muscular, Arnold Schwarzenegger, can barely pronounce his name right now. Just take the cast of the movie Predator, for example. I'm willing to bet every single one of those actors were juiced to the gills. And same thing with kind of most of your bodybuilders you see. When you see somebody and you're like, dang, that person is huge, they got so much muscle. They are more than likely taking steroids. And again, the amount of muscle mass you can produce is going to be limited based on your genetics and your physiology. And sometimes you just were born with just not the best genetic code to aid in hypertrophy. But not contrary to that, but that aside, I think most people don't ever reach their upper limit of muscle mass potential. And so there's a few keys, really only one key that is really important, probably the most important when it comes to adding muscle mass, and that is fatigue. And most people are probably not they're probably not fatiguing themselves enough to promote the amount of hypertrophy that they want. And when we talk about fatigue, we're obviously talking in the realm of resistance training. Going to run a mile and getting exhausted doing that is not going to carry over to muscle mass gains. We are strictly talking, obviously, in the weight room, and I know most people know that. So obviously the reason you have to go to true fatigue is because that is what is going to elicit the most hypertrophic response, and that's pretty well established in the literature. So it doesn't necessarily matter the sets and rep schemes so much, because people love to get bogged down in that. You can have the perfect rep scheme, and if you're not pushing yourself within those sets and reps, you're not going to get the response you want. So it really comes down to fatigue. And I'm pretty sure the research is well established that you basically want to, they call it reps in reserve. You want to have essentially a few reps in reserve to make sure you're not overdoing it and you can continue to train consistently, but you don't want to leave that many reps in reserve as to where you're not eliciting the response you want. And for me, I think the perfect amount is right around 3 reps. So a typical guideline I like is for most of your sets, independent of the reps, all your sets leave about 1 to 3 reps in the tank, and then on the last set you can push it a little bit harder, maybe leaving 1, maybe 2 at the most reps in the tank. And I think the bodybuilders back in the day, or just kind of the old school knowledge around hypertrophy, they got it pretty much right in regards to sets and reps, like 4 to 6 reps or 4 to 6 sets, 8 to 12 reps. Like that is the most simple format, and it's going to elicit the hypertrophy that you want. One thing I like to do as well is a really good way to establish whether or not you're truly going to fatigue is throwing in AMRAP sets, which just stands for as many reps as possible. So if you're someone, and I think a lot of people actually fool themselves because, and I'm guilty of it as well, that they'll do a set that's hard and then they stop at 8 to 10 reps, whatever they're supposed to, and they think they maybe could have got only 1 or 2 reps left in the tank, when in reality maybe they could have gotten 5. And there was a study, I wrote about this, but there's a study that also showed, basically they took people and had them do they asked them what they think their max rep set of 10 would be, and say they think they could have gotten, 185 is their max set of 10 reps. And so they had them do what they thought their max rep set of 10 would be, and most of these people did way more than 10 reps, some even up to 20 reps, which basically shows that what they thought was their max for a set of 10, they ended up getting way more reps, and they weren't probably going to the fatigue they needed to drive the hypertrophy that they wanted. So using AMRAP sets allows someone to really go to fatigue and kind of know where their kind of baseline is in regards to a certain movement. So if I do AMRAP set of bench press and I do 185 for 15 reps, if I have, next week, if I had a set of 4 sets of 8 on bench press, I know I can go heavier than 185 because I did 185 for 15 reps last week. So what I like to do is say, just take the bench press, for example, is maybe do 5 sets of 5, 4 sets of 5, that make those sets and reps, make those sets hard, and then add 1, maybe 2 AMRAP sets on the end of that to kind of build a baseline and kind of know really what they can do for that set of 5 and still like get the fatigue that you need to promote the response you want. So I'm willing to say the most important variable when it comes to muscle mass is fatigue. And you can drive this fatigue in many ways. So if you're lucky enough, I know we're in quarantine right now, but if you have access to a gym, barbells and dumbbells are the easiest to promote fatigue because you're going to be able to load the system up a lot more compared to body weight exercises. And also, disclaimer, you're probably not going to get much hypertrophy, if any, doing body weight exercises unless you're somebody that's just very detrained. Dumbbells and barbells are going to be your go-to if you really want to drive hypertrophy. So if you have access to a gym right now, dumbbells and barbells are the way to go to really drive the most fatigue you want. And like I said, AMRAP sets are great to kind of set a baseline and really know where your fatigue point is on certain movements. Another way you can do it is tempo. So I know like the mind-muscle connection, but tempo is just a different way to promote fatigue if you don't have access to a lot of weight. If you don't have access to any equipment or barely any, you can try to do isometrics where you're pushing against something and still driving fatigue that way. But the biggest bang for your buck is what we knew 30 years ago plus, is dumbbells and barbells are what's going to drive the most systemic fatigue and promote the most hypertrophy because you can just load the system up more than anything else. So and one last thing, so I talked about having reps in reserve and how fatigue is your main point, your main variable that you need to work with, and the most important variable when it comes to promoting hypertrophy. The only kind of disclaimer to that is why I mentioned at the beginning about having 1 to 3 reps in reserve on most of your sets is because you don't want to drive so much systemic fatigue that you can't consistently train throughout the week and you can't build up as much volume and as much fatigue kind of long term and globally if you're just killing yourself on one day. So it's not, you have to take this fatigue factor into account not just on every day, but also on a kind of a more macro approach as well. Because if you're just killing yourself one day, you might not be able to train hard the next 2 days that week. And basically you want to accumulate the most volume as possible week to week to promote the most fatigue long term. So you kind of have a max recoverable volume that if you push it over that, you're not going to be able to recover and keep training consistently. And you also have like this minimal adaptable volume as well, whereas if you're not pushing it into that or pushing it up to that volume, you're not going to drive the adaptations you want. So you have to stick with this kind of minimal adaptable and max kind of recoverable within that window, promoting fatigue in that window to drive the most hypertrophy long term. So here we go. This is it. Hope that helped. A next episode will probably actually be brought to you in the garage. Stay tuned.